Thank you. How's my sound?
It's very good.
All right. In the 2 centuries since its birth, Richard Wagner has been credited with an impressive range of inventions. Friedrich Kittler recognizes Wagner as the founder of cinema. Adorno attributes to the composer's notion of leitmotif the modern-day advertising jingle. And most recently, Nicholas Vazsonyi sees in the Wagner industry the trappings of the 21st century public relations firm. Suffice it to say that Wagner's afterlife has made him an unlikely representative of current conventions in communication, media, and technology. Cultural historian Peter Burke proposes that such apparent connections across seemingly vast expanses of time are only to be expected. After all, according to Burke, the topics that historians choose to study are related to the problems, anxieties, hopes, and debates occurring at the time they are writing. With this in mind, I likewise propose that our own information age offers valuable perspective on historical Wagner phenomena. I argue that our globalized information economy directs us to consider music history in terms of international and even intercontinental processes of cultural exchange and transfer, a critical framework particularly useful when applied to Wagner print culture. For sheet music publications of opera arrangements functioned as a 19th century analog to 20th century technologies of recording and broadcast media. Indeed, many audiences first experienced Wagner's works through the prism of arrangements for domestic music making, published in myriad varieties of what might be called textless translations in Germany, France, the UK, and the US. The term translation is itself apt. Musicologist William Lockhart has persuasively characterized the 19th century parlor arrangement by way of a double metaphor that operates on both local and transnational levels. On the one hand, an arrangement serves to translate orchestral or operatic music into new performance contexts. On the other hand, an arrangement commodifies a musical text, making it mobile across borders and boundaries and rendering its meaning contingent on cultural context. Lockhart, Pache Benjamin, argues that differences between 2 musical texts translated across cultures can tell us more about either than a given text alone. In this respect, his musical framework dovetails with the 3 stages of cultural translation Burke proposes in the transfer of literary cultures, namely decontextualization, recontextualization, and domestication. In this presentation, I draw on Burke's framework to characterize the transnational and transregional distribution of Wagner parlor arrangements. Specifically, statistical analysis of sheet music archives illustrates the extent of this phenomenon of decontextualization. Comparative analysis reveals recontextualization in widespread interconnections across borders, and differences in publications and their publics account for variation in terms of genre, performance context, and fidelity to sources. Ultimately, I contend that the accumulation of arrangements of certain key excerpts subverted the agenda set forth in Wagner's opera reform, opened access to the composer's music to diverse publics, and permitted excerpts to acquire the status of autonomous texts in their own right by means of new modes of listening independent of the theater. Tannhäuser provides a convenient point of departure. For all of its forward-thinking harmony and integration of scenes, the opera is chock full of pieces that function successfully as standalone excerpts. A survey of early Tannhäuser arrangements demonstrates that Wagner and Liszt were not alone in their awareness of the promotional utility and commercial appeal of the opera's most tuneful strains. We may observe this in the Hofmeister Monatsberichte, a serial catalog of new music available for purchase in Germany and neighboring lands from 1829 to 1945. Here you see the 1876 edition in another important Wagner year. Within 6 months of Liszt's 1849 set of transcriptions for Kistner, the competing Leipzig firm of Friedlein responded in kind. Whereas Liszt's transcriptions are remarkably faithful to the letter of Wagner's score, Friedlein instead offered a potpourri of themes from Tannhäuser recomposed by arranger A.E. Marschner. Already, Wagner's musical push toward the future was drawn back into the present, commodified in a generic vocabulary familiar to audiences exposed to the cult or scourge, as Wagner would have it, of the Parisian virtuoso arranger. Altogether, 55 such Tannhäuser excerpts were published in the first decade following the opera's Dresden premiere. Strikingly, 38 of these are identified by genre signifiers of medleys, such as potpourri, paraphrase, and reminiscence. The year 1854 alone witnessed the publication of 12 competing potpourris from the opera. 8 such publications from this period are identified as popular dance forms: quadrille, galop, polonaise, waltz, polka, and incredibly, seguidilla. Thus, the early reception of Tannhäuser's sheet music was significantly shaped by commercial publishing interests which catered to popular tastes. Tannhäuser excerpts, in turn, exerted a long-lasting influence as the most common source of Wagner arrangements in the Hofmeister catalog through 1900, receiving nearly twice as many entries as the entire Ring cycle, indicated by the blue and green bars, respectively, in Figure 1 of your handout that I have displayed up there. Clearly, a broad public was eager to consume Tannhäuser through a purely instrumental mode of listening, not unlike that Liszt engaged when he described the overture as, quote, a symphonic whole in itself. The long-term popularity of Tannhäuser arrangements suggests that Musikdrama competed in an intellectual marketplace saturated with earlier Wagner products. For instance, a striking number of Ring excerpts were published in advance of the tetralogy's premiere. Beginning with the 1861 vocal scores from Das Rheingold, 54 such Ring arrangements were advertised in the Hofmeister catalog during the 15 years leading up to the 1876 Bayreuth Festival. While parlor arrangements from the Ring varied considerably in terms of instrumentation, more were published for solo piano than any other instrument, suggesting their appeal owed something to the pianistic precedent of Tannhäuser. What is more, analysis of the Hofmeister data reveals that Ring publications arrived in 2 waves, addressing 2 distinct publics. The earliest were the efforts of an exclusive group of Vagner disciples, including some familiar characters from our last paper and others. Vagner disciples, an exclusive group of Vagner disciples then were produced with the composer's consent for an audience of musical progressives. This group, however, inspired a second wave of presumably unauthorized publications adapted or recontextualized to reach a wider audience. First, the disciples. Following Karl Klintfort's vocal score here, Karl Tausig and Alfred Jael contributed the first piano arrangements of excerpts from Die Walküre. By making excerpts that had otherwise only been heard in concert available to the public as sheet music, these pianists rendered ephemeral performances into physical artifacts, imparting upon these texts the mobility and longevity to open them to canonization via domestication. While virtuosic paraphrases like Tausig's Walkürenritt would surely have tested the abilities of many parlor pianists, the nocturne like Winterstürme, by contrast, would have fit more comfortably within the typical domestic repertoire of short character pieces. Figure 2 of the handout shows the distribution of Ring excerpts identified by title in the Monatsberichten. Not surprisingly, Winterstürme far outperforms the others in much the manner as the scene of the Abendstern from Tannhäuser. Next came the consummate commercial arranger, Unruly Comet. A one-man song factory, Comet produced over 800 opera potpourris and popular songs in just 4 decades. Within 2 months of the advanced Munich performance of Das Rheingold in 1869, Kramer had already contributed a medley of themes from the drama as volume 175 of his Potpourri sur le motif d'opéra favori. Here he reduced the complete work to a solo piano fantasy of 10 pages in the fashion of his 7 earlier medleys from Tannhäuser and Lohengrin. The 136-measure orchestral opening that so troubled critics becomes a single-page prelude to the Rhine Maiden's song. Its effect is thus tantamount to what Gundula Kreutzer has described as a re-operatization of Musikdrama. Dissociated from dramatic and historical context, Wagner excerpts of all shapes and sizes, from individual motives to entire set pieces, were rendered autonomous texts with self-contained titles independent of their source dramas. Thus, the title Magic Fire Music succeeded in variously identifying an excerpt from Act 3 of Die Walküre, the leitmotif contained therein, or the bravura piano transcription of Belgian virtuoso pianist Louis Brassin of 1874. Such an evocative title possessed appeal independent of any association with Wagner, offering a fitting description of the breathtaking facility required to negotiate Brassin's flashy octaves and fiery leaps. If the publications advertised in the Hofmeister catalog reveal an interplay of German opera with Parisian virtuoso cultures, investigation of American sheet music publications reveals a rich watershed of European and American musical traditions. In 1857, Dwight's Journal of Music boasted that Oliver Ditson's Boston retail store possessed not only all available American music publications, but also an extensive stock of foreign music, indicating a keen desire among audiences for what Mark McKnight has termed cultural validation. As one example, McKnight offers the ubiquitous use of French titles by American arrangers, providing an air of refinement through adjectives like brillant, sentimental, or caractéristique for an American public striving for gentility. Dwight also describes the catalog section dedicated to jobbing music, an insider wholesale exchange that allowed firms to imitate each other's successes. Thus, the geographic radius of a hit excerpt could be greatly expanded, foreshadowing the consolidation of publishing into mass markets. A broad panoramic snapshot of American Wagner publications clearly demonstrates such expansion. Arrangements from the period 1856 to 1900 may be attributed to 24 distinct publishers. During the first 2 decades surveyed, nearly all Wagner publishers were based in established markets for European art music: New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Chicago. Beginning in the 1880s, however, publishers as far afield as Maine, Kentucky, Missouri, and California are also represented. Clearly, markets for Wagner existed well beyond the few cities where one could hope to attend a staged production. From the American metropolis to the heartland, an intranational cultural transfer was at work. Those who did attend American Wagner productions in New York City in the 1870s and 80s encountered a remarkable variety of languages, catering to both immigrant groups and native English speakers. The 1877 Academy of Music season alone, for instance, included an English-language Flying Dutchman, Lohengrin in Italian, and Tannhäuser and Die Walküre in German. Pocket playbills from these performances feature simplified piano reductions of highlights for the parlor pianist that provided opera-goers a means with which to recreate their experiences in the comfort of their own home. These piano arrangements, however, lack accompanying lyrics and thus foreground melodies and themes over considerations of dramatic context or plot. Their titles invite recollections of a particular generic cavatina or chorus, yet do little to remind the listener of the relationship between music and text. That many casual listeners today fail to recall, for instance, that the now ubiquitous Lohengrin bridal chorus occurs not as a processional, but rather during the subsequent preparation of the matrimonial bed by Elsa's attendants, illustrates how dramatic distortions can become received wisdom. Everyone knows the tune, yet few remember the scene. Playbills, however, were by no means the most common vehicles by which opera excerpts entered the parlor. Despite America's relative lack of established opera houses compared to Europe, American audiences consumed opera arrangements in earnest. It is not hard to imagine that many such listeners experienced Wagner without ever attending staged performances. The Library of Congress's Music for the Nation catalog preserves a rich assortment of publications by American arrangers, as well as republications of European arrangements. The catalog's Wagner publications number 76, more than those of any other 19th century opera composer save Verdi with 87. As indicated in Figure 3 of the handout, these publications include excerpts from all of Wagner's mature operas and music dramas, of which over half are from Lohengrin and Tannhäuser. As in Europe, dance forms were the most common generic setting for opera fantasies through the 1850s, as polkas, quadrilles, and galops were sold variously as elegant variations and fancy dances. Despite the proliferation of such light music, amateur musicians in America took piano study very seriously, inspiring a widespread service economy of music instruction. In turn, music instructors became a major driver of the wholesale sheet music market, as publishers offered teachers steep discounts to resell to their students at a profit. The opera transcriptions of Franz Liszt, however, posed a problem for students and teachers alike. With a career that straddled the spheres of the virtuoso pianist and progressive composer, Liszt conflated the otherwise distinct cults of the genius author and the bravura performer, confounding publishers seeking to appeal to popular tastes while maintaining the rhetoric of a high-class aesthetic experience. How could a publisher successfully market transcriptions that were all but unplayable for the average consumer? The American Elite edition of 1884 of the Tannhäuser Overture offered solutions to such problems, promising to do away with, quote, the almost insurmountable difficulties of Liszt's original score, in hopes that this wonderful creation will be appreciated by artists and amateurs alike. What is more, Mill's publisher boldly claims, quote, The work is not simplified or altered, but technically reconstructed. The result is pianist S.B. Mills' edition of Liszt's transcription from Wagner's opera. By positioning the product for amateurs and artists alike, Mills' publisher reached the broadest possible market segment. Piano arranger Henry Maylyth appears to have had a particularly keen sense of this sheet music market, for his prolific output includes hundreds of easy pieces for piano. His corpus is noteworthy as it encompasses an assortment of genres that span the period's emerging popular and classical divide: parlor songs and student pieces on the one hand, and more demanding opera transcriptions, including a substantial number of Wagner arrangements, on the other. Such disparate genres collide in the catalog pages of several of Maylyth's publications, including an 1877 transcription, Winter Storms, from Walküre. Here, Maylyth presented Wagner not as hollowed art, but as functional entertainment. In addition to piano arrangements, a number of publishers presented Wagner for organ, such as there's Winter Storms, such as Hymn of the Pilgrims, an 1876 pipe organ arrangement of the Pilgrim's Chorus. A great many other arrangements of this excerpt were published for parlor organ, already associated with hymn publications for domestic consumption. Religious themes meet profane opera in an 1879 collection, Favorite Operas and Oratorios Arranged for Cabinet Organ, which caps its 2 volumes with the Bridal Chorus and the Pilgrim's Chorus. Likewise, an 1882 publication, Trios and Choruses for Female Voices, includes Homeward in Joy, an English language translation of the Lohengrin Bridal Chorus, virtually indistinguishable from the rest of the parlor organ repertoire. Historian Kenneth Arntz has argued that, Historian Kenneth Arntz has argued that the parlor organ functioned as a link between public and private spheres of faith along gendered lines, female influence over domestic piety versus public institutional worship presided over by men. It seems likely that the popularity of the bridal chorus as a wedding processional was enhanced as parlor arrangements united or married these overlapping spheres and contributed to the secularization of American wedding music. Indeed, by the 1890s, bridal songs were increasingly mass-produced by Union Square publishers and arrangers, yielding songs like Monroe Rosenfeld's 1896, "Those Wedding Bells Shall Not Ring Out." In a 1930 memoir, Isaac Goldberg, a critic for the American Mercury and a friend of George Gershwin, recounts the confrontation of matrimonial song traditions at the turn of the century. They took marriage seriously in the 90s. Every other song, it seems, was a sermon in 3/4 time upon the sanctity of the nuptial promise. Perhaps already operetta was beginning to rival Wagner at wedding ceremonies. And he cites examples, de Koven's Robin Hood being one of them. Goldberg's sermons in 3/4 time were a decidedly new and different sort of sermon in tones than those of the Wagner disciple conductor Theodore Thomas. While the Lohengrin Bridal Chorus eventually fell from favor as a wedding processional, it persisted as a musical signifier in Tin Pan Alley songs addressing courtship, weddings, and marriage. Most famously, Lou Brown's and Albert von Tiltzer's 1912, Here Comes the Bride, replaced Homewards in Joy with new lyrics. I started in to pray, and then I heard the organ play, Here Comes the Bride. It remains unknown whether Lou Brown was the first to use the phrase, Here Comes the Bride, in reference to the conventional processional. Surely no single reappropriation of Wagner's melody did more to distance this music from its original context. Later Tin Pan Alley songs even reference von Tiltzer's lyric as a title for the wedding processional itself. Yet some Wagnerites did not take well to the Tin Pan Alley trend. All right. Some Wagnerites did not take well to the Tin Pan Alley trend. In his autobiography, German-American socialist organizer Oscar Ameringer recounts giving ad hoc recitals to Oklahoma homesteaders in 1907. Ameringer relates, "We played arrangements of Wagner's Evening Star from Tannhäuser, the Bridal Chorus from Lohengrin, and of course, gems from Stephen Foster, America's own sweet singer. They loved it. Those simple people took to good music like ducks to water. Their minds were not yet corrupted by that Tin Pan Alley trash. Besides, classical music is folk music clarified, interpreted, and ennobled by the great masters, and these were folk people." Ameringer's recollection encapsulates several themes: his aversion to Tin Pan Alley trash and his mission to ennoble the simple folk through music smacks of Joseph Levine's theory of the sacralization of European culture in Gilded Age America. Yet his characterization of classical music as folk music clarified and interpreted might be a fitting description of Tin Pan Alley's appropriation of ragtime. His assertion of cultural hierarchy runs against his socialist loyalties, yet embodies the emerging middle brow, what Joseph Horowitz describes as, quote, sacralization metastasized into an insidiously popular movement, a mid-culture based on snob appeal, which rejected contemporary culture, enshrined celebrity performers, and canonized aged European masterworks. Elsewhere in his autobiography, Mehringer relates his childhood in Germany in the 1870s, where he studied Wagner parlor arrangements and performed the Lohengrin Bridal Chorus in a wedding band. He is a man of his era, an émigré with an artistic worldview shaped by 50 years of popular Wagner. No single Wagner excerpt acquired the same degree of autonomy in Europe as Here Comes the Bride did in America, anticipating the ubiquitous place of the standalone Ride of the Valkyries today, a pop cultural signifier, more generic musical topic than recognized borrowing. In the final analysis, the uncontested success of arrangements from Tannhäuser and Lohengrin begs the question of how much of the eventual ascent of Wagnerian Musikdrama may be attributed to the cumulative effect of an accretion of excerpts from the composer's most popular operas. Rather than interpreting the development of leitmotivic analysis as concomitant with the decline of parlor arrangements, these two modes of reception should be instead understood as more or less parallel phenomena that cater to different audiences. The more fundamental trend at work was a diversification of commercial Wagneriana, commensurate with the pluralization of Wagner audiences, a transformation itself enhanced by the dissemination of Wagner's music in print. Wagner parlor arrangements, like Wagner himself, experienced a remarkable afterlife via mass media technologies. A 1905 catalog of the Aeolian Music Company, for instance, offers dozens of player piano rolls of Unruly Comet's Wagner Popurris. By 1919, the recontextualized Lohengrin Bridal Chorus was widely enough known to serve as the title for the Paramount film Here Comes the Bride, one of the first films to be distributed to Allied European movie houses, completing a circuit of cultural transfer that began with European bridal song arrangements. Even as early as 1896, an Edison cylinder recording preserves pianist Joseph Hofmann performing one of Louis Bresson's 1874 Die Walküre transcriptions. Famously, Hofmann would later be among the last surviving pianists of the so-called Romantic Golden Age, one of the last to be broadcast to homes via live television. Many such performers made Wagner a staple in their repertoires. Their activities spanned the era of the peripatetic concert artists like von Bülow and that of the mass media broadcast celebrity who reached millions of listeners. Both generations inspired the collective imagination of a musical public raised on simplified piano arrangements from popular opera. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew, for that excellent talk. Are there any? Christian, you have a question?
Thank you. This was really great. I didn't know about all this material on the English side. You were presenting just bits from a huge material. I have two questions. The first is towards the direction who owned these or who bought these material and who played it. If you have it on the English market in such floods of different arrangements, is it perhaps necessary to correct this view Andreas Ballstedt and Tobias Wittmeier put in their Salonmusik, in this really groundbreaking study, where they draw a view that there was actually no Beethoven lying on the piano, but piles of Salonmusik. And what you are discovering here is another pile, which is in a way in between.
Right.
And so perhaps we have to correct this view, which was trying to correct another view that all people played Beethoven, but there was a lot of this kind of middle music coming from the newest opera music. And the second question is more question for the word. What would be the parallel word for parlor arrangements in German? They were really called this way.
Right.
What would you call them in German? Perhaps I just have no idea or forgot it, but...
I'll answer the second question first, then. That's easier. Klavierauszug is the reduction or piano arrangement is the term that you'd find for most opera vocal scores and four-hand arrangements. But it gets a little murkier as you drift from those arrangements that are most literal or true to the orchestral score. And particularly into the Parisian genres of medley and paraphrase and fantasy and potpourri. And so I'm not sure that there was, it's telling, I think, that the Hofmeister catalog lists all of these opera fantasies with their French titles, despite purporting to be a publication advertising the latest sheet music available in German-speaking lands. So the reason I invoked the critical framework of cultural transfer in large part is because I think there was a German audience for French arrangements and an American audience for German and French arrangements. So globalization is loftily in my title, but which is perhaps anachronistic, but there certainly is a international exchange of not just terms for these publications, but also the audiences, as we well know from Mark Twain and W.B. Du Bois's pilgrimages to Bayreuth. To answer your other question, I think that the Salonmusik, in all three of these, it's simplistic to just describe them, as single entities, but in these three markets, Germany, France, and the United States, the sort of Albumblatt, light kinds of sheet music, both drawn from opera and the emerging traditions of parlor song in America and England and other things like that it would appear there was surely a great more of that than Wagner. The opera publications that came out of the sort of 1830s and 40s Parisian virtuoso culture of improvising themes on three different operas at the same time or what have you. But that said, I suspect that this repertoire is worth considering in greater detail because of how much it precisely like you said, it runs against the grain of prevailing ideas of Wagner print culture historiography. And here is Wagner from the very outset being absorbed into a much more commercial, much more superficial, the very culture he deplored.
Michaela.
Thanks a lot for that really interesting talk. Now, on this, I wanted to comment on the socialist angle here, and my basis of comparison, I have to confess, is entirely Austrian. However, it doesn't surprise me that they would not like Tin Pan Alley a bit. At least in Vienna, the socialists were absolutely virulently anti-popular music. It was seen as capitalistic, overly commercial, and I'm wondering if in the US, if you saw any sign that this kind of classical repertoire was sort of like a gateway drug kind of thing, where eventually we can get them to this is a way of ennobling their taste, which is a lot of what you see in terms of the outreach efforts of the Socialist Party in Vienna in terms of the workers' symphonies and things like that, which you can even see Webern conducting these groups. And if they had any kind of agenda for that, for sort of mass education of the people with these arrangements.
That's a fantastic question, and unfortunately, it's outside of my developing area of expertise. I drew the Oscar Ameriger quote in simply because I was astonished to find something that states outright, we set out to perform Wagner for them in the heartland, such that we might, just like you said, ennoble their tastes or, uplift, cultivate them, what have you. But I think that for me, I wouldn't be qualified to. At this time, at least, to unpack that in a broader context of American social movements in the progressive era. But if anyone else wants to comment on that, I'd be more than welcome to. I would more than welcome that.
I'm sorry, can't can't help you there, but I just wanted to point out, I'm sure you know this, but that this all predates Wagner, that the publication of these scores without words, piano versions of the operas, is at least back into the 40s and I think 30s too, 1830s. So that I don't know if you're trying to make the connection exactly with Wagner. And then I was just wondering about Figure 3 with this Music of the Nation database, or
Yeah.
I was just wondering about the dates. Is there a reason why you chose, or is that just because of what information is available for selecting 1870 to 85?
Those are the years delimited in that catalog.
Yeah, because it kind of is, misleading, I think, because it's a kind of a strange distribution, you would think, overall, but if it's just for those years, fine.
Well, I mean, if you consider the time lag in American Wagner productions, I'm not sure that that's, misleading. I think that.
Just in terms of the overall, of your overall paper, that it would be great if you could have given a bigger sample.
Agreed. Yeah. Certainly, yeah. I should say I did not mean to suggest that. That sample size in the in Figure 3 makes it justifiably comparable to the much broader sample in the Hofmeister catalog. But yeah, I mean, the next somewhere on the list of things to do is to try to go find all of these, and that is a bibliographic nightmare because of the sort of loss of so much of pulp sheet music from the 19th century. But I appreciate the suggestion nonetheless. What was your first question, though?
Just that it predates Wagner.
Oh, well, the culture of opera transcription, surely, but what I'm seeking to emphasize is that many of these publications predate Wagner's own, the widespread distribution of Wagner's dramas in production. Thanks.
David?
Just a small note to say that in the transitional period between sheet music and recordings as a main disseminator of Wagner's works, there was a hybrid moment when the German Gramophone Company in 1909 put together a series of recordings that could be referred to as a kind of music -1 for accompanists or home pianists, so that there were singers actually singing the opera aria with the piano recorded very distantly. My idea is that it was behind the recording horn rather than behind the singer, and therefore not picked up hardly at all. But then the German Gramophone Company then either made arrangements with a music publisher or themselves put together some sheet music so that you could accompany a famous opera singer at home. So
that's a fascinating
Simon
source.
up at the top.
I'd be most grateful if you'd share the citation with me. Thank you.
Thank you. Wagner was chronically short of money. How much money did he get from this? I mean, were there any copyright or royalty laws?
I'd be most grateful as well if someone would share with me if there's any sort of definitive work on German intellectual property law and music publishing, because while there's some really exciting work, Bill Lockhart in particular studied music copyright and sheet music publications in England during the 19th century, but ostensibly, arrangements and transcriptions were considered both in the eyes of the incipient copyright law and culturally to be something apart from the orchestral score or opera productions and libretti and such. So there's I don't think that Wagner saw revenue or royalties of any kind from anyone other than the publishers that he was already working with. So I guess in the beginning, Schlesinger and later Schott. And that's particularly intriguing with these. I mean, I think that there are American publications of transcriptions that are really note for note European publications of transcriptions. Yeah, effectively, yeah, pirate copies, if you will. So.
Okay, time for one last question from Tony.
Just building a little bit on your comments, especially your remarks about some of these transcriptions anticipating their production. Of course, Vagner himself authorized some of this as a way of developing a marketing campaign for some of his productions. And in some instances, we have to remember, of course, that, for example, the case of Parsifal, for the vast majority of Europeans and later Americans, this was the only way in which they could experience Parsifal.
Right. So
I mean, and as it happened, the fact that Vagner did allow a quote, study edition of Parsifal to be produced is part of the reason why the Met was able to create its own Parsifal production in 1903, right. And then even the Amsterdam production shortly thereafter. So I mean, there's a very important role of this in kind of allowing people to consume, to get to know these operas, but not necessarily as operas.
Yes, absolutely. In that respect, that forms a nice addendum to my talk, and also sort of, you can use the analogy of a lost leader for the, early, products, and then a captive market, ostensibly for the Parsifal audience once, yeah. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Matthew, for the excellent talk.